Greetings, welcome to this day of puzzle solving. So in this case, we are playing black. And once again, please define the method on paper. And then we may begin. Just as a quick reminder, the method is the first page we look at all the checks, and exhausted. Then we look at all the captures. And we look at all the moves which make aggressive contact with white's position. I should have that down on paper. Hopefully, you may begin solving this puzzle. So in the first place, you have to look at all the checks. So I notice that queen goes to h2 when we check. And I believe that is the only check that exists. And then we have to look at all the captures here. So in this particular case, queen takes 1c3. Bishop takes queen. Bishop takes pawn on h3. And what other captures exist? Knight takes on e4. Queen takes on e4. And I believe that is it. Now let's make aggressive contact with the queen. Right, we always start with the major pieces. Have to do this systematically. So queen to g5, queen to f4. Applies pressure to the knight here. And then something like queen b5, queen d4, applying pressure to the knight. Perhaps queen d6. There's also applying pressure to this knight and queen. And queen d5 also applying pressure to queen as well. I'm sorry. So queen d6 apply pressure here to the knight. And of course, there are also other nonsense type of moves that you can consider here that you may eliminate quickly during the analysis phase. For instance, queen to g3. Certainly, if those like a word, it looks like a nonsense move, or it must be considered nevertheless. And so now we have to move to the rooks, right? So rook to d8, on pressure to the knight. This other rook cannot make aggressive contact with the enemy position. Let's look at the light squares. So let's observe all of the pieces of white starting the light squares here. So queen on e3, pawn on e2, pawn on h3, pawn on g2, bishop on e4. So for instance, bishop f5 applies pressure to the bishop. Again, we've already mentioned that this capture here exists, but we'll consider for analysis later. Of course, the queen is already attacked. Right to attack this pawn, we have to move bishop takes queen. And finally, we have to look at all the dark squares. All right, what ways can we attack white's position on the dark squares? So knight, I see that knight attack, say, this knight here, by taking knight takes on e4, which we have already considered. So knight to g4, right? Have this some threats here that exist. Applies a slight amount of pressure here on f2, for instance. Okay, and then some pawn moves that exist here. So no pawn move can make aggressive contact with white's position. So now I may begin the analysis. First, by starting off with the most forcing lines. So queen h2 is probably one of the most forcing. The king takes queen, and perhaps bishop takes on b3. In an attempt to get material back, however, if the pawn takes bishop, we are simply down a piece. So there's no adequate follow-up that perhaps leads to mate here. What about the other capture as well? In the first place, this capture seems like it's winning the queen, right? So queen takes bishop. If a simple capture like knight takes or pawn takes bishop back, simply king f8, for instance, here, avoiding any discoveries with check. Right? If castle's here, then bishop takes on h7 check, and the queen may be recaptured. Consequently, bishop takes on b3 rather. Seems like a very strong move. It wins material immediately. Bishop takes queen. Bishop takes on c3, perhaps attempting to get the queen back. So bishop to c3, c6 check rather. And then let's say pawn takes bishop, rook takes bishop, check. Then our bishop can return to e6. And if we can't, you notice that we still have a bishop and a knight. And the opponent only has a knight. So we have one material in this particular variation. So this looks adequate. The only checkmates that exist here. So this seems like the correct solution. So let's solve it here. Bishop takes queen. Bishop to c6 check. And then pawn takes bishop. Queen rook takes e5 check. Then we simply block. And be an upper piece. So now let's move on to the next puzzle. So we notice here the knight on e4 took on c3 here. And yes, somewhat shut down material temporarily. But if we take here back, you might get checked and this rook might be taken. However, we must proceed methodically, as we said. So we have to start off with all the checks, the captures, all the moves which make course in contrast with black's position. So let's start. Queen takes queen check. Pawn takes pawn check. Pawn takes pawn on f7 check. And then bishop b5 check. What else is this? Queen to d7 check is another check, right? And I believe we've exhausted the checks now. Perhaps queen to h4, a4 is also another check. It's the nonsense wolf. However, you must keep it in mind for later analysis. Issue we can easily eliminate it later. Now we move on to all the captures. So pawn takes knight on c3. Should takes might be there, of course. Of course, we've already considered queen takes queen check. Pawn takes on f7 would check. So I didn't hear this. Well, I do not see another. So now we may proceed to the aggressive concept moves. So something like queen c2, queen b3. So aggressive context is they apply pressure to the bishop here on b4. And other crazy moves that exist here. Queen d4, for instance, perhaps applying pressure on g7, perhaps applying pressure to the knight on c3. And of course, other nonsense move exist here. And another move that might exist is queen h5, right? Applying pressure here, bringing mate the queen, right? Queen h5, and then queen takes f7, that would checkmate. So I believe we've exhausted all the moves of the queen. Let's move on to the next major piece. And the next major piece here is the rook on a1 and the rook on h8. They cannot make aggressive contact right now. Then they move on to the minor pieces. Start them off with the minor pieces that are tactile squares. So let's consider all of the black pieces that are white squares. Right, the rook on a8, the bishop on c8, and some pawns here that we have. Pawn on b7, pawn on f7, pawn on h7. Something like bishop d3 to attack on h7, bishop d5 attacks b7, for instance, bishop a6, takes b7 here. This bishop is inaccessible to this bishop. Now let's move on to the dark squares. So the pieces are the dark squares on the knight on c3, bishop on b5, pawn on g7, queen on d8, so something like bishop d2, bishop g5, attacking the queen, bishop h6, attacking the pawn on g7, bishop d7, of course, bishop d2 was already mentioned, right, applying pressure. Bishop 4, perhaps applying pressure to this point, doesn't look adequate. The knight can also attack the squares here. Now d2, for instance, attacks the knight on c3. And then some pawn moves, which make aggressive contact. e7 is the move that I see here, a3. It's another move attacking the bishop. And these pawns cannot do much here. Alright, now that we've exhausted all of the possibilities, we may now proceed to the analysis. And disciplining your thought process in this way is very useful, of course. So, probably the most forcing line is queen takes on d8. But takes on d8, there's only one move. King takes on d8. And there's something like pawn takes. Pawn takes pawn at f7, bishop g5. Check. e7 check. Okay, these moves do not look too adequate. What about pawn takes on f7 check? Well, pawn takes on f7. If king goes to f8, and the queen is lost here, now you will be left a checkmate. So consequently, king e7 seems to be the only move. So this is a very forcing line already. So you're probably on the right track here. And then perhaps bishop g5 check, which we've already considered previously. Could simply move the queen, for instance. And in fact, there will be checkmate. No? Queen up. Bishop g5 check. Yes, that will be checkmate. So this should be adequate, I believe. So let's start. Queen takes up f7 check. And then the bishop g5. Actually, that's not checkmate. Still goes to f8 rather. My mistake. And certainly this is still checkmate check. All right, let's move on to the next puzzle. So once again, look at all the checks, captures, and the moves which make aggressive contact with white's position. So checks here. I see f5 is a check. f4 rather. f4 is a check. Bishop d4 check. Which moves capture here. Moves which capture do not exist, I don't see. So which moves make aggressive contact. So the highest value piece is the bishop. Right here, look at all the dot squares. So we can attack this rook, say rook to f6, attacking the rook. And as difficult to say here, well, then no other pieces are on dot squares. There's only this check on d4. And then pawn moves which are aggressive. So d5, an aggressive move. b5 is an aggressive one with the pawn. And also this is an endgame, so we may also consider king moves. So king f3, king f6 rather, king f6. As I can, the rook on g5 is a move, certainly. Alright, so now let's consider. So bishop, d5, the king takes on d5. This is a very forcing line. I believe it's a very forcing line since f7, f2 would be very close to queening. Well, the king may go back, say, to e2. So perhaps this bishop to d5 is not the most forcing line. How about f4 check? It's another check. In this case, if king f2, then bishop d4 check is certainly very, very strong now. As these pawns are very strong and they support a bishop. So if we have the pawns on dot square or light squares and the bishop on dot squares, we may easily queen, for instance. So this is a very, very strong move. And if king takes pawn, then f2 should be curtains. Why is it curtains? Well, the rook can come back since it's pawn takes rook and it's queening. So f4 needs evaluation for how forceful it really is. So f4, perhaps there's only one move here might exist in this position, namely king to f2, then bishop d4 check, king to f1, for instance, then the simple e5, with a threat of e2, e3, with a threat of e2 check, and then perhaps bishop to c3 check. That would facilitate the queening of this pawn. This is done with a lot of time tempos, so certainly it's very interesting. So we must also consider white's counter chances here with the pawn on a7, h7, right? Consequently, 5 f4 rather. What if king d2? Then certainly here we have here e3, for instance, through check. And this comes with check, so now we have 2 pawns on the 6th. Kind of simple. e7, e2 rather, e2, and then bishop c3 would once again be very good here. And of course, we may always take this pawn without bishop. So we might have a queen versus a rook in this scenario in the end. Consequently, this has to be correct. So for check, bishop to d4 check. And now e3. And the point is, if rook to g8, considering the e7, e2 check here. And certainly but I try to avoid the queening. In fact, that is the only move here. So come here and then bishop c3 would check. Something like king f2 and then queening would check. And certainly here, even if white was allowed an extra tempo to queen, you may always go bishop takes queen on h8 and we are fine here. So let's move on to the final puzzle for today. Alright, we have white to play. Let's look at all the checks and then the captures and the moves which make aggressive contact. A plus position here. So the only check that I see here is queen takes on g6 check. Then the capture is queen takes on e3, for instance. Then knight takes on g6. Knight takes on f7. And then we look at all the moves which make aggressive contact, starting with the highest ranked pieces in middle queen here. So queen f3. Queen takes bishop is also another capture right away. So these are nonsense moves, something like queen f2, queen g1. Certainly these are nonsense moves. Queen g5, blind pressure to this pawn, perhaps even threatening the checkmate here via queen h6. There's also another possibility, as overall the moves in the dossware. So start with the bishop. So bishop to d8, for instance, attacks. This bishop cannot make contact with this bishop on e3. And the knight, certainly the knight here goes something like knight c4. It's a nonsense, of course, but must be considered. Nevertheless, you must discipline out the process in this manner. Knight c4, knight g4, attacking knight d7, attacking the queen on e6. And I believe I exhausted all the moves. So we can do. So now let's look at all the moves which let's rank these moves on the most forcing versus least forcing. So in this case, versus queen takes fg6. Well, there's only one more pawn takes pawn here. Knight takes. It looks like we have down material. Okay, let's capture. Knight takes on g6. Pawn takes knight. If pawn takes knight, then the queen takes on g6, and then certainly now just unlead to a check mate, right? So for instance, king f8, on queen g7, king e8, queen e7 will be checkmate. So certainly this looks to be like a very forcing line. So knight takes on g6. However, here we have to be careful, since black is not obligated to take. So black may, for instance, go king f8. King f8. No, king f8 is not possible, rather. Say king h7. King h7, so there's this check, and then the checkmate on g7 with the queen. What about bishop f2, trying to swipe off the queen in the event of a discovered check? Then we have this double check on b7, and we have checkmate on g7 with the queen again. Since it's a double check, you cannot really take the queen. So I believe that should be adequate, actually. So let's try to solve the puzzle here. So knight takes on g6 suddenly. Bishop takes on g6, and then queen g7 and queen e7 is checkmate here. Excellent work. And that will conclude our tactical puzzles for this day. Thank you very much.